All right, everybody, I am back. Good to be back. And let's get into the topic of the day here. And let me just say this. Outside of stripper monkeys at Texas, and I think you know what I'm talking about, and if you don't, you can Google it. Outside of stripper monkeys at Texas, not a lot has happened off the field going on in college football since the last time that we spoke. And so because of that, what I want to do now is instead kind of go back to the lead topic on Wednesday and kind of expand on it a little bit more. That topic, of course, was the college football playoff rankings. And on Wednesday's show, I did, in fact, talk quite a bit about it. You probably heard it already, but if you didn't, my main takeaways were didn't love Alabama at number 2, not saying they can't get there, not saying they wouldn't be favored against everybody other than Georgia in college football, but if we're basing this on resumes, I don't believe that they have the second best resume and are deserving of that number 2 spot at this exact moment. I did like, however, putting Oregon ahead of Ohio State. I believe head-to-head wins should matter, especially on the road, so credit to the committee for getting that one right. Finally, my main takeaway was I just didn't like what they did with Cincinnati. And to be clear, I don't think that Cincinnati is necessarily the second, third, fourth best team in college football right now. But and again, I understand if you put them on a neutral field with Cincinnati or with Alabama, Alabama would be heavily favored. But at the same time, I do believe two things. I do believe wins on the field should matter. And again, I understand Cincinnati's schedule overall does not compare to Alabama's or Michigan State's or Ohio State's or even Oregon's by the end of the year. They will not be comparable. But at the same time, I believe wins on the field should matter. Cincinnati is undefeated. And more importantly, Notre Dame is really good. Notre Dame is, by the committee's own measurement, a top 10 team, which means that outside of really Michigan State and Oregon, Cincinnati has a best win than anybody in college football. Better than Georgia? Definitely not saying they're better than Georgia. Better than Alabama, better than Ohio State, better than Michigan, better than Oklahoma. Cincinnati's best win is better than most teams in college football. That should matter. At the same time, it clearly doesn't. And at the same time, as I explained on Wednesday's show, I really believe that the committee is already setting up the scenario where one of two things can happen. A team ahead of them can lose and not fall below Cincinnati. So, for example, if Michigan State does in fact lose to Ohio State in a couple weeks, the committee could say, well, Ohio State was already ahead of Cincinnati. They're ranked number 5. Got to keep Michigan State in the top 5 if they lost to Cincinnati or if they lost to Ohio State. But then, two, I also believe the scenario is being set up where the committee can now move teams ahead of Cincinnati if they continue to win. So, as an example, Oklahoma currently sitting at number 8. Well, if they beat Baylor and Oklahoma State, who are both in the top 15, that will be an opportunity to use the excuse to move Oklahoma ahead of Cincinnati. And so I don't believe Cincinnati's in a good spot. I know they're number 6, but I don't believe that they should just be happy to be there and happy to be ranked as high as they are as the highest ever group of 5 team in the initial playoff poll. I believe they're better. I believe they deserve better. And what has happened over the last couple days is a lot of you have asked me, okay, Torres, well, what actually has to happen? What has to happen for Cincinnati to get into the actual college football playoff? I also would say this is probably the single biggest talking point in college football right now. Just listening to other podcasts, listening to radio shows, all that good stuff. A lot of people are talking. Is it possible for Cincinnati to get in? Do they deserve to be ahead of Alabama? Whatever. We can debate and discuss deserve, but what has to happen for Cincinnati to get in? One, we will talk about the on-the-field stuff that has to happen for Cincinnati. And two, I believe that there is a very tactical thing off the field that has to happen as well. And so let's get into it because I believe there are really 4 key points to Cincinnati getting into the playoff going forward. The first, it's the most obvious. Cincinnati's got to win out. They have a schedule to do it. Obviously, we know, again, the schedule is not as challenging as a lot of the teams that they're going head-to-head with. And when you look at the schedule, outside of a game with Houston that is 7-1, 3-1 in the AAC, SMU, by the way, I think I said Houston, but SMU is the team on the schedule, the best team left on their schedule. SMU should be ranked in the top 25. They're not. This shows a little bias from the committee in the first place, leaving out a 7-1 SMU team, leaving out a 7-1 Houston team. But first of all, Cincinnati has to win all of those games. They play SMU on November 20th, which will obviously be 2 weeks from this Saturday. If SMU keeps winning, they will be in the top 25. So Cincinnati, the first part, the most easy part, they have to win out. They just have to win out. No ifs, ands, or buts, because a one-loss Cincinnati team, I don't care how much carnage there is going forward, doesn't matter. A one-loss Cincinnati team is not getting into the college football playoff. They'll put a 3 or 4-loss Alabama team in before they put in a one-loss Cincinnati team. The second thing that I think has to happen from Cincinnati's perspective is this. They really need Notre Dame to keep winning. Notre Dame is the best win on their schedule, and as I said a minute ago, you can argue it's one of the 2 or 3 best wins in college football right now. The only other ones that are comparable are Oregon winning at Ohio State, and of course, outside of that, Michigan State beating Michigan at home. The best thing that Cincinnati can do besides continue to win is continue to have Notre Dame win, and I do think it works out really well for Cincinnati because Notre Dame has a very manageable schedule going forward, and the ironic part is I don't even think Notre Dame is that good this year. I watch them, I like them, I don't love them. They don't do anything at kind of an elite level, but they just keep winning games as a credit to Brian Kelly, and you look at Notre Dame's last 4 games, Navy this weekend, at Virginia next weekend, Georgia Tech, and then at Stanford to close the year. That is a very manageable schedule to go 11-1. Now, whenever you rely on Notre Dame to do something for you, I don't know that they're always going to necessarily come through, but if you're a Cincinnati fan, hope that Notre Dame, which is currently 7-1, finishes 11-1. I think even 10-2 probably keeps Notre Dame probably somewhere in the top 10 to 12 of the final polls. So as long as Notre Dame doesn't have a complete meltdown down the stretch, that's a great thing for Cincinnati. And then the committee has already shown that head-to-head wins matter, again, with the Oregon-Ohio State situation. So your hope is Notre Dame keeps winning, they keep moving up the poll, and then the committee has already backed themselves into a corner that they are going to value head-to-head wins, especially on the road, which means in theory, you would think that Notre Dame cannot pass Cincinnati. So if Notre Dame gets to 6, 7, 5, somewhere in there, in theory, you would have to think that Cincinnati would continue to move up and continue to stay ahead of Notre Dame. What else has to happen with Cincinnati? The third part, it's carnage. Plain and simple, Cincinnati needs a lot of teams to lose ahead of them. And I will say this, some stuff has already started to break well for Cincinnati. Team like Iowa taking weird losses that basically knock them out is huge. Penn State losing to Illinois, knocking them out is huge. But they still need a lot more help going forward, okay? Let me kind of lay out, and I'll try not to get if this team beats that team but loses to that team and then this team wins. I'll try not to do that. Let me try to keep it simple for a Cincinnati fan or just a college football fan listening. The first best thing that can happen to Cincinnati, Oregon loses. Oregon is the only team left from the Pac-12 with a realistic shot at making the college football playoff. Oregon currently sitting right now at, at 7-1. Every other Pac-12 team has at least 3 losses right now. And so a second loss for Oregon, especially because the first loss was to a bad Stanford team, would eliminate the Pac-12 from the college football playoff conversation. 2, they need carnage in the Big Ten from this perspective. You currently have 3 teams with either 0 or 1 loss in the Big Ten. Michigan State is undefeated at 8-0. Ohio State is 7-1 with the loss to Oregon, and Michigan is 7-1 with the loss to Michigan State this past weekend. The good thing is, of those 3 teams, 2 more teams will take a loss at some point because Ohio State plays Michigan State and Michigan plays Ohio State, obviously. So because of that, you have 2 more losses coming, which means in theory, at least one of those teams is going to end up with 2 losses. It could be Ohio State if they lose twice to Michigan and Michigan State. More likely, it means that Michigan will lose to Ohio State, eliminating them. At the same time, you got to make sure that the other teams take at least one, that every team outside of whoever ends up winning the conference has at least 2 losses, okay? So if that means Michigan State upsetting Ohio State to knock them to 10-2 at the end of the regular season and Michigan State going undefeated, that doesn't matter. If Ohio State runs the table, beats Michigan State, you better hope that Michigan State loses to somebody else. And we're going to talk about Michigan State playing Purdue this weekend because that's an interesting scenario. But the big thing in the Big Ten is you need everybody other than one team to have at least 2 losses. Because I truly believe the way this thing is being set up, I don't believe that Michigan State will get dropped too far if they only lose to Ohio State. And if Ohio State beats Michigan, if Michigan somehow beats Ohio State, they would jump Cincinnati. So I know I'm kind of all over the place right now, but you need teams to lose. The other advantage, by the way, Michigan still has Penn State. So Michigan has Penn State and Ohio State. Ohio State has Michigan and Michigan Michigan State. Michigan State has Penn State and Ohio State. So you just need everybody except for one team to finish with one loss, and we assume that there will be a Big Ten team in the college football playoff. Finally, I would say, even before that, the Big 12, I think we're getting a Big 12 team. Oklahoma at this point would have to lose twice. I don't see that happening. If that does happen, it probably means that Baylor or Oklahoma State would finish with one loss. So I'm going to assume that we get a Big 12 champ in the college football playoff, and I'm hoping for Cincinnati's case you only get one Big 10 representative, and then finally it comes down to the SEC. And listen, we can argue it, we can debate it. SEC bias is real. Some of it I think is justified, by the way. We know they have the best recruiting classes. We know they have the best coaches, the best fan bases, the best facilities, the most NFL draft picks. Nobody would argue that the SEC is better. But part of the college football playoff should be based on merit. And so the way that I see the SEC going down right now is pretty simple. First of all, the best thing that can happen to Cincinnati, Georgia, just keep steamrolling everybody, okay? Georgia needs to win out. We need to not worry about Georgia getting to the SEC championship game with losing in the SEC championship game, whatever. But then the next scenario is this, and this is where I'm a little bit torn. If Alabama loses in the SEC championship game as the number 2 team in the country to the number 1 team in the country, Georgia, I don't know that they would fall out of the top 4. I think the justification would be that if Georgia is the definitive number 1 team in the country and Alabama loses to them and doesn't get embarrassed, they will still stay in the college football playoff picture. Yes, I can see the scenario where Alabama as a 2-loss team stays ahead of Cincinnati. So really, the best thing that could happen to Cincinnati is Alabama loses before they get to the SEC championship game again. Looking at Alabama's schedule, they play LSU this weekend. Next weekend, they play in a game against New Mexico State, then Arkansas, then they close with Auburn. So to all the Hogs fans listening, do us all a favor. You don't want Alabama in the playoff, beat them. And then, of course, if Auburn were to pull off the upset, then it would mean that Alabama would have 2 losses if they even make the SEC championship game. If you want a perfect best-case scenario, Texas A&M winning this weekend against Auburn would drop Auburn to 2 losses, and then Auburn beating Alabama in the Iron Bowl would mean that everybody in the SEC West ends up with 2 losses. If A&M runs the table, they would go to the SEC championship game as a 2-loss team. I don't know that they'd beat Georgia, but the point is you don't want Alabama winning out and playing Georgia in the SEC championship game with 1 loss, because I think the committee will figure out a way to justify keeping them in the college football playoff picture. As I mentioned, by the way, so that's what has to happen on the field. Okay, so let me even backtrack. That's what has to happen on the field. Cincinnati has to win out. Notre Dame has to win out in a best-case scenario, and you need carnage. I do believe there is one other factor to this as well. I think Luke Fickell needs to pick up a microphone and start talking. And a couple things. I get why a college football coach in this scenario, he doesn't want to say too much too soon, right? You don't want to say too much too soon because you don't want to put yourself in a situation where, 1, your team gets distracted, or 2, more importantly, you're out there yelling and screaming, we're one of the 4 best teams in college football, and then you go take a bad loss to, Eastern Carolina or whatever, East Carolina, not Eastern Carolina, East Carolina. You take a bad loss to South Florida, you take a bad loss to Tulsa, whatever. I get why college football coaches don't want to do this. I think this is the exception for Luke Fickell, though. I think Luke Fickell has to go into his locker room and behind the scenes tell his guys, look, I am going to go to bat for you. I am going to go to war for you. I need you to go out and take care of the football stuff, and I am going to fight for you like crazy, because at the end of the day, I don't believe that if Luke Fickell is vocal, I don't believe if he fights, I don't believe if he goes to war for his team that anything is going to get done, and I don't think you can wait until after the AAC championship game, that final Saturday in college football. I think it's got to start right now. I think, first of all, he's got to start calling out the committee members by name, okay? If you saw kind of all the stuff that happened over the last couple of days, Luke Fickell, there was kind of a passing comment about being ranked number 6 to start. He was doing his radio show when the college football playoff rankings were released, and he was asked about being number 6, and he said, did Gary Barta, the commissioner of the college football playoff committee, did he actually play football? That's not enough. That is not enough. That is not going to get the job done. You got to call that guy out by name. You got to do what Mike Boynton, the Oklahoma State basketball coach, did. He called out every single member of the NCAA committee that banned his team from the NCAA tournament by name. Luke Fickell's got to go out, get in front of every microphone that he can, and say, Gary Barta, I invite you. Come to practice. Come to our games. Get on the phone with me. Let me tell you about our team, because I think if you stay in the background, it is not going to work out. Beyond that, Luke Fickell, he's got to take this opportunity to take advantage of every major media platform that will have him. Go on Paul Feinbaum. Who cares if Paul Feinbaum's going to ask dumb questions? Who cares if he's going to ask the tough questions? Who cares if he's going to tell you that the fifth best team in the SEC is better than your Cincinnati Bearcats? You have to go out there. You have to defend yourself. You have to fight for yourself, because I don't believe that sitting in the background and hoping that it will work out is going to work. I just don't believe that is going to happen. I don't believe it is applicable. And this is something I've seen a million coaches do before, and I just don't get it. I used this example a few weeks ago, but I was talking about James Franklin, how the best year he had at Penn State was actually year 3, where if you remember, they won the Big Ten, they beat Ohio State head-to-head, and Ohio State still got into the college football playoff ahead of them. I said at the time, and I said on the podcast a few weeks ago when I was talking about James Franklin, I said that was a major tactical mistake from James Franklin. James Franklin, I believe in his head, believed, you know what? We're going to have other opportunities. These playoff chances will come in the future. I'm building something special at Penn State. And he didn't know that 2016 would be his best shot at actually making a college football playoff. He didn't fight for his team. He was happy to go to the Rose Bowl. He was happy to not be in the playoff. And I just thought that was a major tactical mistake. I've seen other coaches make the same mistake. And I don't think if you are Luke Fickell, you can make the same mistake. I know you want to stay in the background. I know you don't want to put too much pressure on your players. I know you don't want to look bad if something crazy happens and you end up losing a game. But at the same time, I see all these comments about I don't do style points. I don't know if you saw this, but he was asked a few weeks ago about style points. He said, I don't do style. My wife picks out my... You can't do that right now, Luke Fickell. If you want your team to earn their spot into the playoff, 1, they have to take care of business on the field, but 2, you have to fight for them. It continues to amaze me. All these football coaches, I just want to stay in the background. I just want to focus on today. We're focusing on Tulsa. We're focusing on who we're playing this week. College football coaches by nature sell their programs every day. They do it to recruits. Yet you won't go public and sell your team on why they should be one of the deserving 4. So Luke Fickell, I'm just telling you, if you're a Cincinnati fan, send this to the sports information department, tag them, tell them that Luke Fickell has an invite on the Aaron Torres podcast. I will fight for Cincinnati as hard as anybody. But he cannot sit in the background. He cannot wait. He cannot hope that come the last day of the season, they're undefeated and he can start fighting for them then. That's what's going to happen. I know it. I've seen it happen a million times. But if Cincinnati really wants to get into the college football playoff, that is what Luke Fickell has to do. Woo! What a segment. That one was fire. You talk about fire? That was freaking fire. This is what I want to do. I want to take a quick break. I do want to come back, and we will get into the Week 10 slate in college football. A really, really interesting slate, really exciting slate. I'm looking forward to talking about it. A lot of good games, a lot of interesting games, but I do want to take a quick break because I'm all fired up. I will be right back momentarily. If you enjoyed this video, do me a quick favor. Make sure to subscribe to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube channel. Also, make sure you're following on social media at Aaron_Torres on Twitter, at Aaron Torres Pod on Instagram.